Look at the card. It is not a postcard, and it is not a love note. It is a record, kept in a woman's own hand, one card for each of her 9 children, lined up in a long wooden box, the way a personnel officer at a bank might line up files. On the card, weight in pounds and ounces, dates of teeth, upper and lower, left and right. Illnesses, with the dates they started and the dates they ended. Vaccinations, circled when the doctor signed. A space for notes. The handwriting is small, even, and never quite hurried. These cards are held at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, inside the personal papers of Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, and for decades she talked about them publicly. The way a proud parent talks about a scrapbook. A woman who records her son's weight at 2 must love him. She never corrected it. Now hold that, because almost every account of the most famous American mother of the 20th century begins with the cards, and almost none of them end there. In the summer of 1961, a friend reported, the new president of the United States complained that his mother had gone off on another one of her trips abroad, and that he had, in effect, been raised by nurses. The friend recalled his exact words, decades later, in a book the family fought and tried to keep out of print. "She never held him," the friend said Jack Kennedy said. "Never." That is a single recollection by a single witness passed through decades of memory, published by a biographer who had lost the family's cooperation and who would never finish his second volume. It is not a verdict. It is a footprint in the snow that has not been explained away, and a documentary that means what the word says, cannot pretend it is not there. Rose herself, in her own warm and readable memoir published at 84, printed a line she liked to tell on the subject. She quoted her small son telling her that she was a great mother to go away and leave her children. She thought it was funny. She printed it as a joke on herself. The country has been laughing along ever since. To see her clearly, you have to go back further than the White House. You have to go back to a noisy house in the north end of Boston, where her father, John Francis Fitzgerald, held court. Honey Fitz, mayor, singer of comic songs, relentless greeter of strangers. A man who believed that if he could shake a hand, he could take a vote, and who made his small daughter part of the performance almost as soon as she could walk. Her mother, Josie, was a quieter presence at home. Rose was the public version of the child, the one on the platform, the one on the ship to Europe, the one presented at the White House to President William Howard Taft at 17. She had been to the White House as a child of Boston Irish Catholic politics before most American girls had been allowed to ride the train alone. She finished Dorchester High School at 15. She was admitted to Wellesley. She did not go. The standard account, supported by the family's chosen biographer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and by later writers, is that Boston's Archbishop, William O'Connell, let it be understood that the daughter of a Catholic mayor enrolling in a Protestant women's college would be a public embarrassment to the church at a moment when Catholic respectability in Boston was a thing one had to defend yard by yard. Her father, who ordinarily let the church have what it wanted, did not fight it. Rose was sent first to the Convent of the Sacred Heart, and then, at 18, across the ocean to the Sacred Heart Convent School at Blumenthal, in Holland, near the German border. She would spend a year carved into prayer and silence, graded on conduct as much as on Latin, taught by women in black to make her own opinions smaller before she brought them into the world. For 85 years, she defended the decision in public. Near the end of her life, privately, she called it her greatest regret. Hold that, too. The girl who was admitted to Wellesley and sent to a convent instead is the same woman who later kept cards on her children's teeth. The convent years ended, and she came home to a city where her father was running for re-election, and a man named James Michael Curley was trying to take the seat away from him. In the spring of 1913, a story began to move through Boston about a cigarette girl at a roadhouse north of the city. Her name, the story said, was Toodles. Curley announced a public lecture series, one advertised title on Great Lovers in History. Everyone in Boston understood the joke. The joke was on Honey Fitz. The joke was on his wife. It was on no one in particular and on everyone, the way Boston jokes were in those years. Fitzgerald withdrew from the race. He blamed his health. His wife, Josie, said nothing, appeared nowhere, and for the rest of her life refused to discuss the matter in any form. Rose said nothing and appeared everywhere, smiling, on her father's arm, at his side through the public collapse. The lesson she said she learned from that year, repeated to biographers in the same words for half a century, was a single sentence. "These things happen," she said, "and one does not discuss them." She was 23. She had just learned what a woman does with humiliation in a Catholic family that depends on its public face. She turns the humiliation into a posture, and then she does not move from it. By then she had been courted for years, in secret, by a young man her father did not want her to marry. Joseph Patrick Kennedy, son of P.J. Kennedy, a saloon keeper turned ward boss turned state senator, Honey Fitz's rival in the same ward politics that had made both of them. Joe was Harvard 1912. By January 1914, he had engineered his way into the presidency of the Columbia Trust Company in Brighton and was telling newspapers that he was the youngest bank president in America, which, at 25, he may well have been. He courted the mayor's daughter as a man with prospects, with a title in hand, and proposed with a ring a banker could afford. Honey Fitz's objection was not that Joe was poor, it was that no one was good enough. It was that a Kennedy would take his daughter off the stage he had built for her. They met at other people's houses. They met at dances her father did not attend. When Fitzgerald shipped her to Europe for a season, they wrote. When he enrolled her in a music program, Joe found the recitals. They were married on the 7th of October, 1914, in Cardinal O'Connell's private chapel in the Cardinal's own residence, in front of about 75 people, at 9 in the morning, with breakfast afterward at her father's house on Wells Avenue in Dorchester. No cathedral, no procession through the city her father had run. Honey Fitz was 14 months past the Toodles collapse. He was politically radioactive. The wedding had to be small because the family that gave it could not afford to be large. They honeymooned at the Greenbrier in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, where Joe played golf. They came home to a modest gray house at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, bought with a loan. 4 children would be born there in under 5 years. Joe Jr. in July of 1915, John Fitzgerald Kennedy in May of 1917, named for her father, the one concession the Fitzgeralds got. Rosemary in 1918, Kathleen in February of 1920. 4 small children in a house with 1 bathroom, and a husband who was already, most evenings, somewhere else. Stop here. Look at the wedding photograph again, if there is one in your hand. Small chapel, 75 people, 9 in the morning. No crowd outside, no ribbon, no review stand. The bridegroom is 25. The bride is 24. Her father is at home in a city where his face no longer sells tickets. She has just agreed to build a family inside a church that overruled her education, with a man her father refused to bless, on a scale her father cannot afford. In 13 years, she will walk out of that family's house and take herself back to her father's door. In 14 years, she will start keeping cards. She did not know any of that yet. She knew the morning. She knew the chapel. She knew the breakfast. She walked out into a Boston autumn and into the rest of her life. And the rest of her life would be run, as much as any life is run by anyone, on a system she was about to invent. The pregnancy came within weeks of the wedding. Joe Jr. was born in July of 1915, less than a year after the small chapel on the Cardinal's residence. John Fitzgerald Kennedy followed in May of 1917 and was given her father's name, the one piece of the Fitzgeralds the Kennedys could not contest. Rosemary came in 1918. Kathleen in the 3rd week of February 1920. 4 children in under 5 years in a gray house at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, a house with 1 bathroom, and a husband who was already, on most evenings, somewhere else. It is worth describing that house the way a camera would. A wooden 2-family, narrow, painted gray, with a small porch and a strip of yard. The street was respectable and not rich. Brookline in those years was the kind of town that respectable Irish Catholics could afford when the husband was starting out, before the husband had finished starting. Inside, the rooms were small. The kitchen was the center of things. There would have been a cook, and later a nurse, and a housemaid whose name the family would not bother to record. Joe was rarely in it. During the war, he took a position at the Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, the hours punishing and irregular. And after the war, he moved into stock brokerage at Hayden Stone in Boston, where the absences grew longer and more voluntary. Rose had no money of her own, no profession of her own, a church that regarded her marriage as a sacrament no court could dissolve, and a father whose political identity depended on the appearance of a happy Catholic family in a clapboard house on a respectable street. She had been raised for the stage her father had built, and now the stage was a kitchen in Brookline, and the audience was 4 children under 5. Then, in the 3rd week of February 1920, 2 things happened in the same house at almost the same time. Kathleen was born. Rose was in confinement, by the custom of the day, kept upstairs, in bed, in a darkened room, seen by the doctor and by her own mother, and not by anyone else. The new baby was healthy. The labor had been hard, but ordinary. 2.5-year-old Jack came down with scarlet fever. In 1920, scarlet fever killed children routinely. There was no antibiotic for the secondary infections. Hospitals in the Boston area were quarantining aggressively, and a child with the disease could not be moved through a public street. Brookline's own hospital would not take a child from another town. Joe, who had by then the connections his father-in-law's name and his own money could buy, had to pull strings to get a bed for his son at Boston City Hospital in a ward set aside for contagious cases. He went every day for weeks. He wrote afterward to the physician, Dr. Edward Place. The letters survive. They are among the most emotionally naked things he ever put on paper. He described the boy, the color of his skin, the size of his hands, the way the fever broke and came back. He made a private vow to give half his fortune to charity if the boy lived. He paid a portion of it, later, to the Guild of St. Apollonia, the Catholic patron of those who suffer with toothache and of those who work to relieve the suffering of children. He told people about the vow for years. Rose was not there. She had just given birth. In 1920, a mother of a newborn was kept in a darkened room upstairs, and a father, who could get past a hospital quarantine, went to the ward. The reason was legitimate. The pattern began here. The father was the parent who showed up in the emergency. The mother was the parent who, later, would write down on a card what the emergency had been. Jack survived. He was sent to a sanatorium in Maine to convalesce, in the clean air, away from other children, for what must have felt to him like a small eternity. He came home thinner. The arrangement that had formed around his illness did not dissolve with the fever. It stayed in place for the rest of the family's life. A few months after Kathleen was born, Rose walked out of her own house. The date she gave for it depended on when she was asked. In some tellings, it was right after Kathleen. In others, a year or 2 later. What stays constant, across all her accounts, is the shape. She packed a bag. She took herself to her father's house on Wells Avenue in Dorchester. She stayed about 3 weeks. 4 small children under 5 in Brookline. Husband traveling, making money, on the road. She told an interviewer, decades later, that she had begun to feel she was nothing but a bystander in my own life. The phrase has the slightly worn quality of something said aloud many times. She had not been consulted about the scarlet fever. She had not been the one at the hospital door. She had not been allowed into her own labor. The convent had taught her that a clever woman makes her opinions smaller before she brings them into the world. Wellesley, where she might have been taught something else, had been taken from her. She was 25 years old, and the life she had been trained for since childhood had been replaced by a life she had not been trained for at all. Her father came to talk to her. The substance of what he said is preserved only in her memory and held loosely, but she repeated it consistently for half a century. The Fitzgeralds do not do this, he told her. She had made her commitment before God. The children needed her. She should go home and build the best life she could inside it. She went home. First, a religious retreat. Several days of silence at a convent in Boston. She came out of it with a decision, not a feeling. The decision was not to be happy. The decision was not to leave. The decision was to convert the marriage into a job. She said it herself, in print, in public, for the rest of her life. She had decided, she said, that motherhood would be a profession, and that she intended to be as expert at it as any man in a bank. Listen to the language she chose. A profession, expert, a man in a bank. She was describing herself as an executive of a household, with measurable outputs and a system for achieving them, and she was describing her husband, by implication, as someone whose work she could model her own on. Not affection, not romance, not the language of convent piety, the language of an institution. It is worth pausing on what this actually meant in 1920, in a Catholic household in Brookline, with no money of her own, with a husband who could afford anything and would not be crossed, with a church that would not annul a marriage for unhappiness. It meant she was going to do what she could do. She could not control her husband's time. She could not control where the children went to school. She could not control the family's money. She could not control who came to dinner. She could control what the children ate, when they ate it, who they sat with, what news they knew, what questions they were asked at the table, and whether they went to Mass. She could keep the records of it. She started the system that year, or that spring, or within a few months of her return. The cards, a scale, weights on the cards, a clipping file, news pinned to a board in the kitchen so the older children could be quizzed on current events at the table. 2 dinner sittings, the younger children at one and the older ones at another, the seating fixed so that the conversation could be controlled by the woman at the head. Latecomers not fed. Church attendance not optional, on Sundays and on holy days of obligation, and on the feasts of saints whose stories the children were expected to be able to recite. Notes pinned to her dress, when there were too many children to remember what she had meant to tell each one. Later, when the children were grown and scattered, mimeographed round-robin letters mailed identically to all of them, like bulletins from a headquarters. Jack, in his teens, wrote back to her in the same format, mocking the form, suggesting the circulars would be improved by advertising. The cards were the foundation. They were not a sentiment. They were a record. They were the kind of thing a chief of staff keeps on a principal, and a principal's children, when there are 9 of them and the principal is rarely in the house. In later years, Rose would defend the cards as proof that she had loved her children with care. A woman who records her son's weight at 2, she was often quoted as saying, must love him. The country took her at her word because she had been trained to make her words small enough to be believed and large enough to be useful. What the cards actually record is something a documentary has to be honest about. They record a system imposed on children by a woman who had decided, before her second son was 4, that her own life was not hers to live. The system was real. The children were, by any measure, exceptional. They were verbal, competitive, informed, physically fearless, and unusually good in a room. And that came from her drills more than from his money. This is not a hit piece. Children raised under her rules became a president, 2 senators, an ambassador, a journalist who founded a national magazine, and a handful of others whose names are still attached to wings of hospitals. Whatever the cost, the product was real. The cost was also real. The system did not produce anyone who sat with a sick child for the duration of the illness. The sick child, almost from the first, was Jack. Whooping cough, measles, chickenpox, scarlet fever. Then, after scarlet fever, a decade of abdominal illness that no one in the family could name, and weight loss that the cards recorded in pencil. Rose, in her own memoir, wrote about him in a tone that later readers found unsettling. A boy who was always getting sick. They had almost given up on him more than once. The phrasing is the phrasing of a manager reporting on a portfolio that has underperformed. The boy was her son. Stop here, before the next child is born. The household is now 4 children under 5, in a house with 1 bathroom, in a town her husband has already decided to leave. The cards are beginning. The retreat is over. The job has been accepted. In a few years, the family will move twice, and the oldest boy will collapse at a school he was sent to against his mother's wishes, and the husband will begin an affair with the most famous woman in American movies, and Rose will start to travel, alone, for weeks at a time, paid for by the man she has agreed not to leave. All of that is ahead. The hinge is here, in a kitchen in Brookline, before Jack is 4. The system, once it was set, did not change. It grew. The cards expanded into a full record. The scale was bought and put in a closet. Weights were tracked in pencil and updated in her own hand. Clippings from the day's papers were pinned to a board in the kitchen so that the older children, at the early sitting, could be asked what was happening in the world and graded by the tone of the answer as much as by its content. Dinner was at a fixed hour. The younger children ate at one sitting and the older ones at another. A 2-tier arrangement that lasted for years. If you were late, you did not eat. Church attendance was not a suggestion. The children were expected to know the liturgical calendar and to be able to name the saint of the day. Notes were pinned to her dress when there were too many children to remember, by the end of the decade, what she had meant to tell each one. Later, when the older children were at school and the younger ones were at the table, and the house was too big for one woman's memory, the notes became mimeographed round-robin letters, mailed identically to all the children on the same day, like bulletins from a headquarters office. Jack, in his teens, wrote back in the same format and mocked the form. Her circulars, he suggested, would be improved by advertising. She thought that was funny too. The system worked. A documentary that means the words it uses has to say that plainly, in this scene, before the next one. The children produced under those rules were, by any honest measure, exceptional. They were verbal, competitive, physically fearless, informed beyond their years, unusually good in a room. They could hold a dinner table. They could hold a press conference. They could hold a Senate committee. The reflexes the country admired in a Kennedy in public came out of her drills in the kitchen long before they had anything to do with his money. This is not a hit piece. It is the record. The record is that a woman who had been told her life was not her own set out to make a life-sized product out of the materials she had been given. And the product was real. The system also had a shape that the country was not invited to see. It did not produce anyone who sat with a sick child for the duration of an illness. The sick child, almost from the beginning, was Jack. After scarlet fever came whooping cough, measles, chickenpox, and then a long decade of abdominal illness that no doctor in Boston could name and that pulled weight off him in pounds at a time. Rose wrote about him, in her own memoir at 84, in a tone that later readers found hard to place. A boy who was always getting sick. They had almost given up on him more than once. The phrasing is the phrasing of a manager reporting on a holding that has not performed. The boy was her son. The household kept getting larger. Joe kept getting further away. Beale Street gave way to a bigger house on Naples Road in the same town. In 1926, Joe moved the family to Riverdale in New York, and in 1929 to a mansion in Bronxville. The reason he gave, in his own letters and later in family recollection, was that Boston's Protestant establishment would never let his children in. The Catholic schools were out of the question at the level he was aiming for. By then, he was a bank president, a broker, a board member of companies whose names were on the doors of office buildings, and the head of a household he was rarely inside. In 1926, he rented a house at Hyannisport on the Cape, and in 1928, he bought it. The compound that the country would later know by a single address, with its windbreaks and its lawns and its view of the harbor, began as a real estate decision and ended as a stage set for the family he was building. By 1927, Joe was running his own motion picture companies in Hollywood. The biggest female star in American pictures at that moment was Gloria Swanson. He took over her production company and her finances and brought her into his orbit and then into his houses. Palm Beach, Hyannisport. He introduced her to his wife. In the spring of 1929, all three of them crossed the Atlantic on the same ocean liner, the Ile-de-France. Photographs of the crossing survive. Rose is in white. Swanson is in a wide hat. Joe is at the rail. They look like any three people on any first-class deck in any year. The first-person account of that time is Swanson's own memoir, published in 1980, late in her life and in her own interest, settling a money score she had carried for half a century. She is an interested witness. The surrounding facts, however, are not in dispute. Kennedy brought Swanson into his houses. Kennedy took her to his wife's rooms. Rose met her, hosted her, and, by Swanson's later description, behaved in a way Swanson could never entirely read. She could never work out, Swanson wrote, whether Rose was a fool or a saint. After the affair ended, by whatever ending it had, Rose did something she had not done before. She started to travel. The record of it is in her own diaries, which biographers who worked from them agree on in scale. In the 1930s, she made on the order of 17 trips abroad. Several of them ran 6 weeks or longer. Some she took with her sister Agnes, some she took with a friend. Most she took without her husband. All of them she took without her children. She shopped in Paris. She kept lists of what she bought. Joe paid. Joe did not object. She did not ask him to come. The trade has to be stated plainly, because a documentary that means the words it uses has to. She stopped expecting a conventional marriage and started billing him for the difference. She got clothes and travel and an unassailable religious position and a name that would become a brand and, eventually, an ambassadorship to enjoy. He got a wife who would not leave, would not complain publicly, and would not, in 80 years of interviews with the press, confirm a single thing about another woman. That is the arrangement. It is not the only arrangement a Catholic wife of that class could have made in 1930 in America. It is the one she made. The schooling of the boys is where the arrangement got tested in public. Rose wanted her sons in Catholic schools. She lost most of those fights. Joe Jr., the heir, was sent to Choate, the Protestant boarding school in Wallingford, Connecticut, because his father wanted his firstborn where the New England establishment was. Rose won a partial concession on the second son. Canterbury School, in New Milford, Connecticut, was a Catholic boarding school, and it was the only one Jack Kennedy ever attended. He was 13. He was homesick. He was already thin. In the spring of 1931, at Canterbury, he collapsed with appendicitis. He was operated on. He was withdrawn. He never went back. That autumn, at 15, he followed his brother to Choate. She lost. The pattern held across all 9 children: where they lived, where they schooled, what money they got. She lost most of the consequential arguments. She kept the symbolic ones. Mass, the calendar, the rules of the table, the shape of the room. In 1938, Joe was appointed United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's. Rose went to London as the wife of the American ambassador. She was presented at court. She kept a diary of dinners, of seating, of dresses, of who was placed next to whom. By every account that survives, including her own, those London years were the happiest of her life. She had been by then 24 years a professional. The profession had an embassy attached. Look at the photograph. The steps of the embassy. The daughters in white court gowns. The wife in formal dress slightly ahead, the way ambassadors' wives are always slightly ahead in such pictures. The husband at the top of the steps. The country that would later associate the Kennedys with Hyannisport and the Cape saw them first, in its imagination, on these steps. The photograph is the argument. It is also a setup. Hold it next to the daughter the photograph does not show. Rosemary, born 1918, slow from the beginning. The London years were the years in which the family handled her in the way the family handled everything, with careful language and quiet management, and the long practice of not saying out loud what was being said. She had tutors. She had been placed in a convent school in England during the embassy years. The daughters in white in the embassy photograph had a sister who was not on the steps and would not be. The ambassador's appeasement position would later destroy his own political future. That is a separate story, and it is not her doing. She enjoyed the embassy while the embassy lasted. The professional had an instrument at last, and the instrument was an ambassador's wife. And the country that had never known what to make of her Catholic respectability and her travel and her cards was about to learn, because the man at the top of the steps had arranged for them to learn what such a wife looked like when she had a stage again. Stop here. The mansion is in Bronxville. The compound is at Hyannisport. The school is Canterbury and then Choate. The boy has collapsed and recovered and followed his brother. The man is in Hollywood and then in London, and the woman is on the steps. The system has been running for 15 years, and it has produced children, and it has produced an arrangement, and the arrangement has produced a trade, and the trade has produced a wife who does not object, and a husband who does not stop, and a son who is sick in a way the cards cannot fix, and a daughter who is slow in a way the convent cannot teach around. Both of those children are about to collide with the system in ways the system was not built to absorb. Rosemary was slow from the beginning. The family knew it. They handled it the way the family handled everything, with careful language and quiet management, the long practice of not saying out loud what was being said. Special tutors from the time she was small. A convent school in England during the London embassy years, where her mother could visit and her cousins could not quite tell, and where the nuns were paid to be patient in ways the public schools would not be. Clippings about her in the press used a softer language than the press used about her brothers. She was sweet. She was gentle. She was religious. The cards, of course, recorded her weight and her dates and her vaccines, and her mother updated them in pencil for years. By 1940 and 1941, she was back in America, in her early 20s, and increasingly difficult to contain. She had been placed in a convent school in Washington, and from that school she was going out at night in ways that terrified her father. Her safety was one reason. The family name, in a city where the family was about to try to elect its first Catholic president in a generation, was unmistakably another. In November of 1941, Joseph Kennedy authorized a prefrontal lobotomy on his eldest daughter. The operation was performed in Washington by the neurologist Walter Freeman and the surgeon James Watts. In 1941, the procedure was still presented in the medical literature and in the popular press as a promising new answer to problems that had no other answer. Thousands of lobotomies would be performed in the United States in the next 20 years, on patients who had asked for them and on many who had not, before the procedure was recognized, in the profession and in the country, for what it was. Rosemary's operation failed in the way the worst outcomes of the procedure failed. She was left unable to speak clearly. She was left unable to care for herself. She was eventually moved to St. Coletta, a Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, that cared for people with severe disabilities. Rose's account of the operation, given late and reported most fully by Kate Clifford Larson in 2015 in a book drawn from the family's own papers, is that her husband arranged the entire thing without telling her, and that she learned what had been done afterward. The family papers, on the question of who knew and when, are not unanimous. Larson's reading of them is that Joe hid the operation, hid the outcome, told the other children almost nothing for years, and that Rose was, by the standard of a wife in 1941, with no money of her own and no legal authority over an adult daughter, overruled and frozen out. That is one reading. The other reading is also in the record, and a documentary that means the words it uses has to give it. Nobody physically prevented Rose from getting on a train to Jefferson in 1955 or 1950 or 1955. She traveled constantly. She went to Paris. She went to Rome. She went to the shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes. She did not go to Wisconsin. The first visits on the record began after Joe's stroke in 1961, when he could no longer control the family's information. The timing is a fact that sits in the record and does not move. And it is not, by itself, proof of anything. It is also not nothing. Both readings are honest. A woman with no money and no legal authority who was told by her husband that her daughter had been handled and who lived inside a household in which the husband handled everything was not, in any practical sense, free to override the decision. And a woman who crossed oceans every year for pleasure and who kept mimeographed bulletins going to all her children for decades did not get on a train to a town in Wisconsin for 20 years. The two facts sit next to each other. The film does not have to choose. 2.5 years after Rosemary was taken away, the same collision came again, this time with Rose moving first. Kathleen, called Kick by everyone who knew her, was the funniest and the most socially gifted of the children. The English aristocracy had adopted her, in the way the English aristocracy adopts young women of breeding who happen to be in London during a war and who happen to be Catholic, without being solemn. She had been presented at court before the embassy years ended. She had danced with the sons of dukes. By 1944, she was in love with William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. The Devonshires were not merely Protestant. They were, by the long arrangement of English life, hereditary standard-bearers of English Protestantism. There was no compromise available on the question of the children's religion, in either direction. The Cavendishes would not raise Catholic children. The Kennedys would not consent to be erased on a question of faith. They were married at the Chelsea Register Office on the 6th of May, 1944, a civil ceremony, no priest, no church, no procession. The only Kennedy present was the eldest brother, Joe Jr., who came as witness. Family accounts in later years record that he paid for it in his mother's regard. He was the last of the brothers to be on good terms with her, and he was about to die. Rose was in New England Baptist Hospital. The family said stomach trouble. The timing of the admission and the speed with which she had been brought in led several biographers to read it as a collapse. From her hospital room, she cabled her daughter to stop. She had the Archbishop's office in Boston contacted. She wrote to the wider family, in the round-robin format she had used for years, about the disgrace of it. Kick, in letters of her own that survive, understood what her mother had done. Her mother had chosen the church over her, in writing, in front of everyone. The choice was made in the same tone that the cards were kept, in the same tone that the dinner sittings had been enforced, in the same tone that the schooling arguments had been fought and lost. It was the institutional loyalty, asserted without drama and without apology, against the child who had crossed the line. The marriage lasted 5 weeks before Hartington went back to the front. He was killed in Belgium in September of 1944, a month after Joe Jr. died flying a volunteer mission over the English Channel. Kik, in her first months of grief, received letters from her mother in family correspondence, and among the thoughts in those letters was the thought that God had intervened. Kik stayed in England. She was a Kennedy widow in London in the winter of 1944, and by 1947 she was involved with Peter Fitzwilliam, an English earl who was married and Protestant and preparing to divorce. Rose's position in the surviving letters was total. If Kathleen married him, she would be cut off from the family, and, by the surviving accounts of the family's financial arrangements, from the money. In May of 1948, Kik and Fitzwilliam were killed in a plane crash in France, on the way to the south of France, where Kik had hoped to make her father meet the man she was going to marry. Joseph Kennedy was in Paris on business. He went to the funeral at Cavendish, the family seat in the north of England, where Kik had first been received in 1940. He was the only member of her family at the service. Rose did not attend. Her own later account, given to the family and reported in the standard biographies, was that she was at prayer. Hold that, the way you held the small chapel in 1914 and the gray house in 1920. A mother in 1948 has just lost her eldest daughter in a plane crash in France, the third of her 9 children to die in 7 years. Her husband went to the funeral. She stated her prayers. The terms she had set had not bent. Her daughter had been told, in writing, that the family and the money and the church came first, and her daughter had crossed the line anyway, and her daughter had died. There is no evidence in the record of a softening, and there is no evidence in the record of a public statement of grief outside the family correspondence that the family itself controlled. She lost 3 children in 7 years. Rosemary, in 1941, to an operation performed by her father's authorization and her mother's later silence. Joe Jr., in 1944, as a naval aviator over the Channel, volunteering for the mission that killed him. Kik, in 1948, in a plane crash in France after a marriage her mother had refused to bless. The losses are not the same kind of loss. The silence around them is. The country, in the same years, was being told the other version of the family, the daughter-in-law's account, the son's account, the matriarch at the head of the table, the matriarch at the funeral, the matriarch on the embassy steps in 1938 and at the senator's campaign headquarters in 1952, the matriarch with the cards, the matriarch who wrote the round robin. The country took the version that was offered because the version that was offered had been engineered to be taken, and because the women who could have offered a different version had been managed into silence, or were in Wisconsin, or were in a plane in France. Stop here, before the next room of the house is opened. The compound is at Hyannisport. The institution is in Wisconsin. The funeral is in Cavendish. The cards are in a wooden box on the 2nd floor of the house on the Cape. The son who survived is in Boston, in his late 20s, about to be handed the family name for a run for Congress in his grandfather's old district. The mother, who lost 3 children in 7 years, is about to walk into a hotel ballroom in a white dress and white gloves and start receiving, for the next 20 years, the version of the family that the country will learn to love. The machine she had built for the family had one remaining use. It could be aimed. In 1946, Jack, 29, thin, awkward on a stage, ran for Congress in the 11th District of Massachusetts, his grandfather Honey Fitz's old ground, the ward where his great-grandfather had been a saloon keeper and a ward boss. He won. The instrument the campaign invented, and that the family would use, in some form, for the next 20 years, was the reception. An engraved invitation, on heavy paper, with the family's name embossed at the top. White gloves. Tea and small cakes in a hotel ballroom in Boston, or in a rented room in one of the mill towns north of the city. The candidate's mother, seated, receiving. A line of women that wound out the door. Rose worked the lines for years. She told stories about raising the boy, about the cards, about the waits, about her father, the mayor, in the same tone she had used for everything since the convent. In 1952, against Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., the Kennedys held on the order of 33 of these teas in the district. Lodge's people watched women wait 90 minutes to shake her hand and understood by the end of the summer that they had no answer to it. She spoke French and Italian in the immigrant wards. She could tell a room in Somerville about the Court of St. James's and make it sound like a neighbor's news. She was the most effective retail politician in the family after her father, in her 60s. She was also, in those speeches, writing the first draft of the version of herself that the country would inherit. The devoted mother, the 9 children, the cards, the mass every morning of her life, the husband she had stood beside through triumph and ruin. It went into the papers, into the magazine profiles, into the campaign literature that the family printed and mailed and handed out at the hotel ballroom doors. By 1960, it was simply what Americans knew about Rose Kennedy, because she had said it in person several thousand times. The version had been tested in rooms. It worked. In November of 1963, at Hyannisport, the reports of that afternoon are consistent on one detail. She went outside and walked. Her husband, upstairs, disabled by the stroke he had suffered in 1961, was not told that day. The family managed the information inside its own house for a full day, holding it from him until Ted, the surviving son, could be brought there to do the telling. 5 years later, Bobby was killed. She came out of the funeral and told reporters, in the same tone she had used for the teas and the cards, that she was going to keep going. The country decided, in that moment, what it felt about the woman it had been watching for 30 years. Not the mother of a president, the survivor. The stiff, tiny, upright figure at 4 funerals, with a rosary in her hand and a face that did not break on camera. The country loved her for it. She had given the country the version that made it possible to love her. In 1974, at 84, she published Times to Remember, written with Robert Coughlin of Life magazine. The book is warm, detailed, and extremely readable. It is also a legal document. Rosemary's operation is handled in a few careful sentences, the disaster compressed into a sentence or two about the difficult child and the family's love. Kick's sorrow is softened. Joe is presented as a devoted father whose ambition was a kind of generosity. The other women in Joe's life are simply not there. The book was a bestseller. Almost every later profile of Rose Kennedy, including obituaries 30 years later, drew from it. She was also sitting on the physical evidence, the Kennedy papers, the letters, the diaries, her own decades of correspondence were in the house at Hyannisport and in the houses her children occupied. And she and the family controlled who was allowed to see what. In the late 1970s and the 1980s, she and her children granted Doris Kearns Goodwin extraordinary access to the family papers for the book that became The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys in 1987. It is still the standard account of her early life. It is also still shaped, by Goodwin's own acknowledgement, by what the family chose to hand over. Writers who worked without permission got a different experience. Nigel Hamilton, a British historian, was given access to certain Kennedy papers for a planned multi-volume biography of Jack. In 1992, he published a book that included the harshest things Jack was reported to have said about his mother, including the friend's recollection of the friend in the summer of 1961, and the line, never quite verified, about a mother who never held him. Hamilton's relationship with the family ended with that book. The second volume of his biography, planned for years, never appeared. Other portions of the Kennedy papers at the Kennedy Library in Boston remain restricted to this day, decades after her death. She died on the 22nd of January, 1995, at 104. The obituaries carried the same phrases, in the same order: the rosary, the 9 children, the mother who raised a president, the woman who had outlived 4 of them. The phrases were hers. She had been writing them in speeches and in interviews and in the round-robin letters and finally in the memoir for 70 years. The country received them the way it had always received them, as fact. Return to the cards. Hold them in your hand the way you held them at the beginning. For 70 years they were offered as proof of devotion, offered by her, in her own voice, in interviews and in the memoir, and in the round-robin letters mailed to the children on the same day in the same form. A woman who writes down her son's weight at 2, she would say, must love him. She never corrected it. No one in the family corrected it. The cards passed, with the rest of the papers, into the box at the library with his name on the door. They are there now. Read them again, the way a documentary has to read them, not the way a memorial film would. They are not a mother's keepsake. They are the first entry in an archive. They are the same instinct that kept every letter in the attic at Hyannisport. They are the same instinct that produced a memoir at 84, with the difficult parts compressed into careful sentences. They are the same instinct that decided which biographer got the trunk and which got the door. They are the record of a woman who understood, before most American women of her class had understood it, that a household is a state, and that a state's first obligation is to control the story it tells about itself. She did not hate her son. The honest formulation, the one the evidence supports, is not the formulation a tabloid would print. She ranked him. She ranked him below the church. She ranked him below the family name. She ranked him below her own hard-won peace, the peace she had bought with the cards and the rounds and the careful sentences in the memoir. She raised him the way she raised the others, under a system that produced results and that did not produce, by design or by accident, a woman who sat with a sick child for the duration of an illness. Then, when he was gone and could not answer, and when the brother who could have answered was gone, and when the daughter who could have answered was in Wisconsin and could not answer in any voice the public could hear, she wrote the account of it that the country believed. Jack Kennedy has a library with his name on it, on a hill in Boston, overlooking the harbor. His mother chose what went in the boxes.